Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll begin now. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this side event, and I promise it will be provocative, it will be interesting. My name is Shakrufe Zanji. I'm the Global Technical Lead with the Early Childhood Development Action Network. And today we're here to take a deep dive to explore the role philanthropy can play in accelerating high-quality early childhood education care system reform. That's right, I said the word reform. Through the examination by the Thrive by 5 campaign in Australia, that's been extremely successful, and we want to understand how this can be taken other places, and what role philanthropy can play. But before I begin, I want to say that the session is hosted by the Thrive by 5 initiative of the Minderoo Foundation, which is the largest philanthropic foundation in Australasia. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Honorable Jay Weatherall, who leads the Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 initiative, which has had some extraordinary success in driving early childhood development system reform in Australia. So welcome, Jay. I also have with us Nathan Coblins, who's the Portfolio Manager for Early Childhood Development at Porticus Foundation, which is a family philanthropic organization that supports work in 90 countries focused on human dignity and social justice. Welcome, Nathan. And then we have Muniza Intikum, who's no stranger to most of us here, but the Senior Program Officer of the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Welcome, Muniza. And finally, but not the least, Nathalie Kasovikarani, who's the founder and general delegate of the Ensemble for Early Childhood Education and a member of the First 1,000 Days Commission with the French government. Welcome, Nathalie. All right. So without further ado, since we're running short on time, Jay, why don't I turn it over to you for remarks, and we'll watch a video and then have a panel discussion.
Lovely. Thank you, Shukafei, and thank you all for attending this session. And it really springs from this idea. Whenever I move around this conference and all the wonderful discussions about what an early childhood education and care system should look like and how we could build that into a broader early childhood development system, the overwhelming question that keeps being asked is, how do we make governments work with us to let that happen? And so what this session is fundamentally about is answering that question. How do we get governments to move? And what's the role of philanthropy in actually getting governments to move? I suppose the starting point is really an analysis about the sector. We all believe this. We all think it's really important. But we're not strong enough by ourselves. That's the fundamental starting point. The people that work with little children, and even their parents, are very busy, they're disconnected, they're not really a very powerful political force. So how do we actually, from that starting point, build a coalition of sufficient strength to be able to get governments to move? And that's the other key issue here. Governments have got lots of things on their plate, lots of choices to make about what's important. How do we get our issue from being a 10, 20, 30 order issue up to a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issue? So how do we make our issue politically salient? And in a way, it's pretty simple. Most politics, certainly in democracies, are governed by the strength of public feeling. Politicians need to respond to the demands of their citizens. So how do we organise our citizens in a way which means that their voice is powerful and coherent and capable of being heard? And the basic thesis is that, that just doesn't happen by itself. The people that are interested in this, for the non-for-profits, don't have a lot of spare time to devote to campaigning. So if you do want to actually have a campaign which is effective, you need to provide resources to do that. And that's really the question we're posing. Is there a role for philanthropy in carving aside a small portion of the amount that they give to actually fund high-quality campaigns that put pressure on governments, that put early childhood development at the top of the agenda? So that's really what we're talking about. And I think now we have a short video that we want to show that just explains some of the internal thinking of how we actually ran that campaign. So, Kirsty. can you set us away? There we all are.
Here in Australia, one child is born every minute and 43 seconds. Our future welfare, prosperity and success as a nation depends on our newborns and ensuring that every single one of them grows up to be kind, capable, productive and resilient.
To start, we knew the science is clear that the first 5 years of a child's life are crucial for a child's lifelong development. But the system in Australia basically ignored the early years.
We need our politicians.
What's the politician?
That's the people who lead us.
They have to take early learning seriously.
We needed major policy change at the national level, an agreement between both the federal and state governments to implement that reform.
We worked with Jay and his team at Thrive by 5 to develop the Outside Track campaign strategy. That used detailed research, earned media, digital, advertising and production to put pressure on our political leadership on both sides of the fence to listen to public opinion.
Secondly, we ran an inside track policy and engagement process that would bring together key stakeholders and policymakers under Chatham House rules.
So we brought government, NGOs, experts and advocates together to refine the ideas. Then we could build understanding with the public servants and advisors, and they ultimately inform the key decision makers, the government ministers. Together we developed a blueprint for a universal guarantee for young children and families that would make Australia the best place in the world to be a child and raise one. This reform plan for a high quality, accessible, affordable early childhood system was called Starting Better.
We made a list of everyone we could think of that might have an interest in this issue. That included business leaders, think tanks and not-for-profits.
This has meant we have a depth of understanding and support that has evolved into a brilliant alliance. At the moment we have more than 70 campaign partners and it's still growing.
Our guiding philosophy was many voices, one message. To achieve that, we created 4 campaign narratives that gave our partners a storytelling platform and connection to the campaign. Children's brain development, boosting the economy, gender equality, and cost of living pressure on young families.
So we had the solutions in a policy blueprint. We had the campaign strategy. We had an alliance with a shared message. So we got to work. From there, we ran a sustained, intense, public-facing campaign across 2 years.
We made sure our issue was in the headlines at every opportunity.
The coverage made it very hard for politicians to ignore us. We had over 12,000 stories in the media, all talking about why change was needed. We recruited 80,000 people to the campaign as Thrive by 5 supporters. Parents, educators, academics, anyone who cared about this issue and wanted to see change. We produced videos that told the story about why this issue mattered from all different angles, from children talking about why it would help their development, to the leader of the Business Council of Australia talking about boosting productivity.
It's time to fix the system and make it easier to work and raise children.
We ran a digital advertising campaign targeting decision makers in government and our key audience, which was women with children.
I was asked to be an official voice for educators in the Thrive by 5 campaign. It was incredible because it meant that I could bring the real life experience of working in the early learning system to the campaign. It meant we, as educators, were embedded in the campaign every step of the way. We created ads that spoke directly to educators about the issues that they were facing every day. We asked them to sign up, become an official friend of Thrive by 5, and essentially they stepped up to become leaders of the campaign.
kids in the country are twice as likely as city kids to start school developmentally vulnerable, which means 40% of country kids.
The Childcare Deserts report showed that 3.7 million people living in the country have poor access to early learning and childcare. Around 1 million have no access at all. The Thrive by 5 Alliance amplified the Childcare Desert report in the media through a special event with politicians and by bringing together organisations that work in rural and remote communities who hadn't previously engaged in the campaign.
The Minderoo Foundation had the courage and vision to take on a big challenge like reforming early learning and childcare, regardless of the opposition it engendered and the complexity of the task. The Forest's strong business connections helped us bring business and civil society groups together so that we could wage a truly politically bipartisan campaign. What we've achieved in the space of 2 years has been nothing short of astounding. Together, our campaign has led to
the federal government committing to invest $5 billion to increase the childcare subsidy to 90%.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese committing to deliver a universal early childcare system for Australia. And we're not done yet. We won't stop until we've achieved our goal.
This year, myself and Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 launched our final campaign. It's the final one because we will not stop until we achieve our goal. A high quality early learning system for all.
So we can thrive by 5.
Drive by 5. Fly by fly. So we can fly by 5.
Thanks, Shay. So I'll give the audience a few moments. Are there any questions about the Thrive by 5 campaign that we can clarify at this time? Does anybody have a question about the Thrive by 5 campaign? Is there a hand up? Oh. Yes. Could you introduce yourself? Would you introduce yourself first? Yes. It's not on.
Yeah, good morning. Now it's functioning. My name is Darem Tabba. I'm Minister of Education in Syria. The film is fantastic, but I hear that 1 million child still out of ability to come to kindergarten in Australia. The reasons, what do you think the reasons in Australia, in such a country where they have all the facilities, they have funds, they have policy makers, why those children are not able to continue their education from 3 to 8 in a good way? Because I'm comparing with a country like Syria who have no facilities, have wars and so on, and when we say 1 million, it's okay. But in Australia, it's a high number. So we have to look for the reasons. If you can explain me, please.
It's a very good question. There's no good answer. And that's really the purpose of the campaign, to say that this is unacceptable in a rich country, that children don't have access to high quality early learning throughout their life course. I think the reason is that really in the early years, I mean, we've got strong coverage for preschool, so the year before school, and very strong coverage through school. But in those early years, which we've typically called childcare, it's really been seen more as part of employment policy. It's a place where you put your children while you go to work, rather than being seen as part of the early childhood development system. So that's the journey on which we're on. It's beginning to change, and our campaign is really about changing that entirely. So, it's a historical issue. Partly also the way the system is run at the moment, it's a market, and so half of the system is run by the private for-profit sector, and because parts of Australia aren't profitable to provide childcare, then it's not provided, and that's another reason we want to change the system.
Thanks, Jay. Well, let's begin this conversation. I think that was such an inspiring campaign, and it seems like such a clean, nicely packaged story. 2 years, and we have this massive change, and I'm really curious about, what that means for other philanthropies and what perspectives you have. So Nathan, I'd love to hear from you about what this campaign, what stands out as unique to you, especially from the perspective of the Porticus Foundation, in terms of an advocacy campaign for early childhood.
Thanks, Shakufe. And so just before I start, so I want to say a thanks on behalf of all of us for Jay and the colleagues at Minderoo for sharing this case study. We don't really get the chance often to pick apart, like, what was it that made this successful. So this is a really nice opportunity for us. As Shakufe introduced me, so I work for a philanthropic organization. We support partners to do similar types of work in early childhood development in a small number of countries. You'll hear from one of our partners in France, in Brazil, Haiti, and Bangladesh. We're also engaged in this type of work. We don't implement in the same way that Minderoo do, but this is the kind of reflections that I'll share are kind of based on what we see as good practice and what's really interesting about this case study. Maybe just a very quick reflection at the beginning of what is probably not good practice, but what's often the standard approach to these kind of campaigns. Sometimes these campaigns come from government to try to encourage people to take up a particular service or change behavior. Often it's from outside of government, from a university or an NGO. What typically happens is you kind of combine all the evidence that you have, you translate it into a way that people that you're sending it to understand. You put on a big event, something like this, and then you basically kind of throw that evidence and towards the people who are going to make decisions. And so that approach in the early childhood development sector, I think, is probably too common. I think we're often very technical people in early childhood development. All of us in this room probably have the same set of beliefs around what constitutes a good childhood, and so our belief is often if we can just tell people that better, then they'll change their decisions. There's 5 things that I'm just going to touch on and really to kind of stimulate your thinking about this too, that stand out about Thrive by 5 that didn't take this kind of approach. First of all, I think just having this very large goal that lots of different people could align on. We heard in that video there are the different perspectives from the economic argument, the child development argument, the labour force argument. Having a kind of broad enough goal allowed lots of other people to kind of combine within it. As we all know, early child development we're segmented. We've got education, child protection, health, and so often we're just sitting in our own silos arguing for our own advocacy points. Secondly, just this flexibility of having, I think it was 4 different narratives available for people to use at whatever point, whichever audience they're talking to. So to have that flexibility, not a kind of there was, I think, one of those narratives was about the science of children's development, but the other 3 were making different cases. So to give those advocates within Thrive by 5 that flexibility to adapt their message. Thirdly, and I think for me this is the part that really jumps out, is having these 2 tracks. You heard it described there, this outside track and the inside track. Outside track we're often very good at, this talking to government, saying this is what we think you should do. But the inside track, which begins with civil servants and ministers, asking them what it is that would be a feasible policy solution. So when this demand from outside comes, there are feasible solutions on the table already. And that combination, I think, is for me like a really brilliant aspect of this. Fourthly, and this is more for reflection on those of us in philanthropies, this was a very well-resourced campaign. Minderoo, and all credit to them, put the finances behind this that was necessary. So often we, as philanthropies, we see advocacy as a kind of It's like a part of the budget that you should probably do after you've funded the services that should be done. But here we see the kind of, I think the experience of those in Minderoo with that campaigning, that if you're going to do this, it really has to be financed securely and properly. And finally, and I don't think this was touched on in the video, so maybe Jay, if it's of interest to the audience, could touch on this a bit more. But during the campaign, there were these kind of spin-offs, these unexpected other consequences that came from this. There was a council set up for early childhood development, another focused on, I think, Women for Progress, around, again, women's role in the labour market. So again, so these are things that aren't directly tied in or weren't envisaged as part of the early childhood part of the campaign, but these are vital things for keeping up the momentum further down the line. So those are, from my perspective, the 5 things that really kind of stand out here as a different practice and good practice. And again, thanks for sharing it all from Jay.
Thanks, Nathan, for those excellent reflections. I think there's a lot in there that, Jay, I'm wondering if you want to respond to Nathan's last point.
Yeah, just the point about spin-off things. We found pretty quickly that the gender equity argument was really the most powerful driving force in the campaign, and that surprised us a little. We thought it would be important, but we didn't realise it would be as dominant as it was. And when we did our research, we expected women of childbearing age of children under 5 would be an important ally. What we hadn't realised is women with even primary school children were also very vitally concerned about this, even though they'd passed through that period, because they remember what it was like, and they're still angry about how hard it was, and they can see the effect that this continues to have on their life opportunities. They see the choices they've had to make in terms of employment, what they've had to sacrifice, and how that's disadvantaging their lifelong earnings, etc. So that caused us to create a mechanism called Women for Progress, which was more than early childhood. It talked about other things like violence against women. It talked about equal pay, a whole range of things which were tangential to but connected to early childhood. And so that went off and almost had a life of its own and became a spin-off campaign which reinforced our messages, but it was overlap in a sense.
Brilliant, thanks, Jay. So I want to go to Natalie. Natalie, it would be great to hear from you, because I'm curious about, in the French context, what implications does this campaign have? Are there lessons that could be potentially relevant to your context, and also maybe touch on the broader European context if you can.
Mm-hmm. Do you have your headphones? If I speak in French, is it okay for you? Yes? For most of you? Okay, good. Merci beaucoup de votre invitation. Nous sommes très honorés d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. Et j'ai pu expérimenter l'éducation en Australie pour mes 3 enfants. Ça a été un pays merveilleux pour leur éducation. Donc, merci beaucoup à vous. En France, le paysage a beaucoup changé en 5 ans. Les ministres chargés de l'enfance n'ont pas été très nombreux dans ces dernières 10 années. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons, grâce à une mobilisation européenne et nationale, pu vraiment avancer dans cette advocacy. Aujourd'hui, et depuis 5 ans, avec cette évolution, nous avons donc commencé une campagne européenne. Et la vôtre est extrêmement inspirante, avec des résultats très robustes. Nous aimerions avoir autant de résultats significatifs en Europe, mais nous nous sommes réunis avec les 500 grandes associations françaises, parce que nous sommes le leader en France en tant qu'association pour rassembler ces forces en France avec 8 autres pays en Europe On a lancé une campagne qui s'appelle First Years, First Priority, et nous avons été en capacité de mettre au point un plaidoyer commun, ce qui n'a pas été facile. Et on rencontre des challenges, évidemment, parce que mettre autour de la table les politiques publiques, le secteur privé, la civil society et puis les bénéficiaires, on a tous des intérêts différents. Et évidemment, l'écriture est très compliquée. Mais on n'a pas obtenu en termes de fonds vraiment ce qu'on souhaitait, c'est-à-dire cette garantie pour l'enfance avec le fonds FSE+, qui aurait pu nous aider à cibler ces fonds vers la petite enfance. Ils ont continué en Europe à être ciblés vers l'enfance, ce qui est regrettable, mais nous avons quand même franchi un pas. Et aujourd'hui, nos ministres, en tout cas notre gouvernement, est plus concerné par le sujet, a lancé un plan interministériel de lutte contre la pauvreté chez l'enfant, avec aujourd'hui une mise en œuvre qui commence à porter ses fruits, a lancé une commission sur les 1000 premiers jours, dont vous avez peut-être entendu parler, avec le docteur Boris Cyrulnik, dont je fais partie, qui a permis de partager un consensus scientifique sur le développement de l'enfant, à jour des connaissances. Et puis, donc nous avons un ministre chargé de la santé qui a aussi en charge les questions de la famille et de la petite enfance, et un secrétaire d'État qui est chargé de la protection de l'enfance. Mais récemment, en août dernier, à la suite du lancement de la campagne européenne First Years, First Priority, qui était très basée sur le partage de ces compétences sociales et émotionnelles dont on a beaucoup parlé pendant ce congrès, qui sont la base du développement holistique de l'enfant, eh bien, nous avons maintenant un texte interministériel, multisectoriel, qui est une campagne nationale pour favoriser, pour promouvoir ces compétences du XXIe siècle, qui sont les compétences sociales et émotionnelles, qui sont intéressantes à discuter aussi dans le cadre de votre campagne. Donc il y a eu un effet bénéfique depuis 5 ans évident, grâce à la mobilisation de nos 500 associations ensemble. Et là, c'est la force de la communauté qui fait foi, parce que seul, on peut aller vite, mais ensemble, on va loin. Et on peut aller tackle the challenges. Vraiment, aujourd'hui, on est à ce tournant de... On a fait grimper le niveau de conscience collective avec des campagnes de sensibilisation très importantes qu'on a menées aussi au sein de notre association, avec un train qui est allé dans l'ensemble des 14 régions en France, et puis une campagne qu'on a co-construite avec le Québec, avec 50 vidéos sur le développement de l'enfant qu'on a traduites en 3 langues. Il y a eu 2 millions de bénéficiaires directs de cette campagne, et on voit que dans l'ensemble de ces univers, eh bien, on arrive à faire résonner le sujet de la petite enfance. Ce qui nous manque aujourd'hui pour réussir ce tournant et faire de ces intentions une réelle action nationale autour de la protection de l'enfance et de l'accompagnement du développement de l'enfant dans les meilleures conditions, c'est 200 000 places de crèche supplémentaires pour atteindre nos objectifs en 2030. Et avant ça, se préoccuper de la qualité, de développer la qualité, de savoir ce qu'on met derrière ce terme de qualité, avant de mettre en place ces structures d'accueil pour la petite enfance, et à réfléchir en amont à comment résonne la qualité dans nos pratiques quotidiennes et comment on suit la qualité, parce qu'il n'y a pas encore de monitoring de la qualité en France sur l'ensemble de ces éléments, de ces indicateurs qui font le corpus commun de la qualité. Et ça, c'est un des grands messages qu'on veut passer à ce congrès, c'est réfléchissons à ce qu'est la qualité du lien avec les enfants, la qualité de la relation, la qualité des compétences professionnelles, avant de mettre en place nos structures d'accueil. Parce que, après, pour déconstruire les pratiques, c'est très, très compliqué. Voilà, donc ça, c'est un message important dans la campagne. Et puis, et mettre en place les instruments, évidemment, de suivi de cette qualité. Ça c'est en termes de message. Mais vraiment, en France, on a progressé en termes d'évolution. Et aujourd'hui, on attend plus de fonds. Les entreprises viennent sur le sujet. On a mobilisé un certain nombre d'entreprises par le biais d'un label sur la parentalité. Et les entreprises sont davantage financeurs de la politique familiale. Les fonds publics, les fonds privés, on est tous évidemment concernés par cette grande cause nationale qu'est la nécessité d'agir tôt. Alors je vous citerai peut-être des exemples concrets si vous le souhaitez tout à l'heure.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. That was really inspiring to hear about what you are doing in France. And so that brings me to Manisa, because we've heard now of an example from Australia, from France, and I'm curious about your perspective, and what is the relevance of this approach, especially in the Global South context, with the countries that the Hilton Foundation partners with. Do you think this would work for a foundation like yours to take this approach?
So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Shekufe, and I want to echo Nathan and really thanking the Minderoo Foundation for sharing this example and actually for giving us, I would say, a really good global public good that we can take and use and adapt to our different contexts. So as Shekufe said, I work for the Hilton Foundation, and we support programs in early childhood development in East and Southern Africa. And then specifically, we work in partnership with governments and partners in Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, but really with a vision to see how that can support work broadly in the region, and also, I think, have replicable examples for the Global South. So a lot of what I take from the Minderoo Foundation as well is a really good example of how I think it's upon all of us to try and package and put together what we're learning in order to support developments elsewhere. So there's a couple of things I think about the approach that are relevant for our context. And I think one is understanding that the problem analysis that the Minderoo Foundation did is quite aligned with what we see as the challenges in East and Southern Africa as well. As Nathan already alluded to, as you all know, early childhood, multi-sectoral, very complex, sometimes competing messages, sometimes often competing ministries, and it can be a very difficult role to navigate. Another thing that I think is really relevant is, as they had in Australia, or they have in Australia, a very complex administrative level and level of governance around early childhood. So the national level responsible for the policy setting, the regulation, but devolution being really critical for the delivery of services. And if I think about one of the countries we support, Kenya, there are 47 different counties, each now with the responsibility to deliver a range of early childhood services, primary health care through to early childhood education. And that gives a level of complexity like they also have in Australia. And then the last thing that I think is really relevant to our context as well, I'd say it's globally, is that rarely we see young children as being at the heart of national kind of policy setting agendas. Either we think about early childhood as being, that's about learning, or that's about addressing, in my context and region, nutrition, that's about health, when actually it's about all of that and more, because it's about how you create the human capital in order for your countries to develop and thrive socially, economically, politically too. So I think a lot of what happens in Australia is definitely relevant for the context we work in. But for your second, and also I should say the strategies employed are also relevant, the inside track, so that's where you're doing the really hard policy work, the technical work, but the external track, which is really about making noise and bringing in a whole variety of audiences and opinion formers so that this is seen as, many voices but one message. I think that's relevant. But I think where this differs is a really important point, your second question. In essence, no, we wouldn't as a foundation take that approach. But what we would do as a foundation is support a partner that wanted to take that approach. And I really want to come in on this because I think this is really critical. The Minderoo Foundation is Australian, co-founded by Australians, led by Australians who understand their context really very well because that's their context. I work for an American foundation. Our headquarters is in California. In no way would it ever be appropriate that we lead a campaign for young children in Kenya, Tanzania, or Mozambique. Why would that ever be appropriate? I don't think in Australia or any other country, I'm from the UK, we would want an external country running a campaign on our behalf for our children. However, I definitely think philanthropy has a key role to work in close partnerships and to provide the space, the flexible funding to support such campaigns, because we do need that kind of advocacy at national level to really propel the early childhood agenda and to really, as I said, position an investment in children as an investment in the economic and social development of a country. And it might be in many, definitely in the countries I work with, that a lot of the tactics employed in Australia wouldn't necessarily resonate. So we probably wouldn't send a bunch of letters to MPs in Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. The postal system, I should say, is not perhaps the most set up for that. We might not do scorecards. We might not do TED Talks necessarily. But the points of all those is that I think they were activities to drive a particular strategy, which was, how do we get the sense to our political leadership that there is a demand from citizens and from society for us to do better by our young children? We might not send letters, but there are many ways in the context we work in that we can get messages through. There are often, community meetings. There are often fora for engaging with leaders at local level as well as national. And I think the point would be, how could we use those existing mechanisms to get the messaging and the point across? So in answer to your question, Shakufe, yes, I think a lot of the context for Australia is relevant to the context many of us work in, but we would have to take a different approach given who we are, in regards to the countries that we try to support.
Brilliant. Thanks, Manisa. Jay, I want to come back to you. And, what's compelling about this campaign is you're being provocative to the early childhood field and saying, we need to make the journey from the technical to the political with our philanthropy dollars. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that reflection as well.
That took a lot of effort in getting to walk across that bridge, because a lot of philanthropies have very close, or not-for-profits have very close relationships with government, so many of them receive their funding from government. So the idea of being involved in a campaign that puts pressure on government starts to look political, and political is a sort of a dirty word in the not-for-profit space because it looks illegitimate. But we had a big argument first to win about the fact that if you're serious about advocacy that's ineffective is not regarded as political. Advocacy that's effective becomes political. Now, if we're just going to fund advocacy that's ineffective, we're wasting our money. If it genuinely does shift opinions and create pressure, then it is going to be perceived by some people as political. And that's a hard thing for some people to hear. But it was a necessary conversation we had to have. It was sort of like a maturity that the sector had to accept about whether they are actually serious about being players. And one of the points that Manisa made, which is relevant to the international context, was actually even relevant to us, even as an Australian foundation. Because we're a relatively new foundation and we're proposing this somewhat confrontational message, we had to step very carefully, because there are a bunch of people saying, well, who are these guys? They're new and telling us how to think. We've been doing this for 30 years. And we had to be very respectful to respect that history and not say, oh, look, you don't know what you guys are doing. We're taking over now. So it was very important that the campaign is not our campaign, it's brought to you by us. So it's very much, the people that are in this campaign are there because they choose to be here. So the barriers to entry are very low, and the barriers of exit are very low. So people are only in this campaign for as long as they want to be in it, and it's their campaign. So it's actually, while it's the Minderoo Foundation, we very much call the campaign the Thrive by 5 campaign. And that was one of the reasons we created a separate identity so that other people could populate it with their own identities. So we had to be, in the same way as you would say coming in from another country needs to be respectful. We even had to do that within our own context.
Thanks so much, Jay. In the last few minutes we have, I do want to turn to the audience. If you have questions, I'll ask the panel a question while we're waiting for that. But Christy, what I'll do is collect all the questions in one go, and then we'll have a round. So yes, if we can begin, that would be great. Please introduce yourself, and please do ask a brief question.
Hello. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. This is Bushra Kadura from Sharjah Private Education Authority. The question is, with the philanthropy, I always miss that one. The Global Child Forum is really advancing, working on advancing children's rights in businesses, which are the core of this. And the UNICEF have developed the framework, and we're working towards that for a call. How can we merge association with the work that the Global Child Forum, especially in businesses, because that's where the money is. And children's right, early childhood education is based on children's right. And there is a whole framework on how businesses can advance in children's right. There was a call by all Rotarians in the world, which are about 1 million businessmen and women, to support and advance children's right in businesses. So how can we merge these, and how can we support each other on working with that?
Thank you so much. We have 1, 2, 3, 4.
I wanted to ask...
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Paul Crystal from ECDAN. I wanted to ask a little bit about when you were speaking about services before, and that idea that those need to be in place, or we like to build upon services. What's the pitch when you're looking for participation, to bring in the money when businesses and other sources of contribution may have a natural attraction to funding direct services and have this hesitation about talking so much with government when that might not work, or it might work and it's quite expensive, and everything involved in media campaigning.
Thank you. Percy. Yeah. Percy, we have in the front here and then here.
Good morning. This is Bhushan Punani from India. I just want to share that when we wanted to promote philanthropy, we went for the concept of CSR, community corporate social responsibility. So country made a law that every corporate, Indian or foreign, operating in India, shall provide 2% of their profit, net profit, for CSR. Because of that, $700 million came into the kitty of philanthropy. And interestingly, the health, education, child development, all three are covered. So if you are having a ECCE in India, and if you want to raise money from the corporate, it's much easier to provide. Now I want to ask you, do you have such, I know America has, and a couple of countries have, do you have such initiative in your country? If yes, very good. If not, please try for that. That's number one. Number two, we have gone for a concept of compulsory and free education, including primary education, now will be CEH, where the state provides for all the expenses. So if you have that initiative, yes. If not, I request you to have that, and I'd like to know whether these are the steps in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And one last question in the front here. Oh.
Docteur Traoré Mamadou de la République de Côte d'Ivoire. Le problème de l'enfant est important en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est pour ça que plusieurs ministères adressent la question. En ce qui concerne...
Un moment.
En ce qui concerne... Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Donc, en ce qui concerne la campagne concernant la philanthropie, on devient un peu comme un groupe de pression sur le politique. Est-ce que les gouvernements ne peuvent pas dire que, au contraire, vous cherchez plutôt à les renverser ou bien à faire quelque chose de contraire parce que vous devez un groupe très fort? Donc, le politique peut interpréter ça autrement. Alors, comment vous, en tant qu'organisation philanthropique, faire en sorte que l'État puisse concilier votre demande et sa vision politique? Voilà la question que je voulais poser. Merci.
Merci. Great. So we have a few minutes to respond to these. So let's begin. Who would like to take? Why don't we begin with you, Maniza? Is there a question?
Perhaps I will address two points. So the first policy point, yes, I think the route that India has taken to have fee-free pre-primary, primary is the right way to go. And many of us who advocate in the global south in countries like I support, that's what we try to push for. And I'm happy to say just last year in Tanzania, the government made a commitment to fee-free pre-primary. And I think with that also comes the responsibility of the education system to put in place a proper system for pre-primary where we have the right curriculum, teaching, all the rest of it, and the right policy. So I do think that's the right direction to go, and I congratulate India for that. And I was on a panel yesterday where we had a Ministry of Education official from India really describe that for us, and I think it is an example for many. To come to this last point, I think the key thing about this isn't about the philanthropic vision for early childhood in my mind. This is about the national vision that is aligned with what a lot of our governments put down on paper. There's probably no country in the world that we can pick on that doesn't say there's this commitment to young children, they're our future, what I would say, blah, blah, blah. The point is, we need to put that into some kind of reality and practice. And so I believe it is most governments' vision to put in place a system that they think is best for young children. They don't deliver on that vision. And so I think it is about actors in those countries pushing and advocating for government to live up to that responsibility and accountability it has. So I really want to say that it can't be about a philanthropic vision. What's the national vision put down on paper? Where are the gaps in that vision? And what's the role of this group of very multifaceted advocates from business, from the service delivery itself, from parents, from citizens, etc., to push that agenda forward? So it can't be the philanthropic vision.
Thank you, Maniza. Nathan, very quickly, we've been told that we're going over time.
Maybe just to quickly underline Maniza's point with an additional part. So we heard yesterday from the World Bank of their commitment to funding childcare. Governments need to ask the bank for that, and often ministries responsible for early childhood development are underfunded compared to other ministries. So this hand in hand with civil society, your early childhood development ministry, you have the same goals, more funding for ECD. So that's not from the outside, this is a way to combine that effort together. A final response to as well to the point about advocacy or funding services. Some funding, particularly CSR, is just better designed for funding tangible things, building classrooms, training teachers. I think that's the role for philanthropy, to take the bigger risks with things like advocacy. So there isn't a magic message to convince a funder to go from one to the other, I don't think, and it is more suitable for others than it is for some.
Thanks, Nathan. Nathalie?
Merci. Je voudrais adresser deux points à ce stade de la discussion. Le premier, c'est qu'il y a de l'advocacy à l'échelle internationale. L'OCDE, l'UNESCO adressent des rapports sur nos sujets qui sont absolument fondamentaux et qui résonnent avec 3x5 et First Year, First Priority. Aujourd'hui, comment se fait ce lien entre ces recommandations internationales et nos politiques nationales? Pour l'instant, ce n'est pas encore très fluide. Ça, c'est le premier point. Comment on peut les rendre plus fluides? Et le deuxième point, c'est ne pas tomber dans l'effet pervers qui serait la philanthropie est là. Elle vient accélérer les process, mais aussi elle vient en incubation, comme pour notre exemple en France avec Accompagne-moi. Et heureusement que la philanthropie est là, parce qu'elle vient démarrer des actions et elle vient les accélérer. Mais l'effet pervers serait que les États se désengagent. Et pour citer l'exemple en France, on a en effet plus de communication autour du sujet, mais moins de fonds dédiés pour la petite enfance. Alors, comment les entreprises, comment l'ensemble des partenaires, comment cette alliance peut s'organiser autour d'un plaidoyer efficace et qui engage les États, parce que c'est d'abord un service public, et comment le secteur privé peut dialoguer dans un schéma, dans un système vertueux avec le secteur public. Ça, il y a encore beaucoup de challenges à relever.
Merci.
Voilà.
Thank you. And last but most definitely not the least, Jay, you get the last word.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And I suppose one of the messages that we really want to communicate is that philanthropy, I think, has a special role. It can do things nobody else can do. I think that's the single most important thing. What it looks like in each country, I think, will be very different. And so the speaker before about business, talking about the business connections, that is something which might be more available in some countries than others. It's certainly something we're beginning to explore in Australia, but it will be different tactics, I think, depending on which jurisdiction that you're talking about. But one of the things that's necessary to make all of this work is resources. One thing that Natalie talked about, she only touched on it briefly, but it was about how do we line all these people up, which can be a challenge. We spend most of our time doing that. Most of the resource we spend is keeping everybody unified around the campaign. And it sounds like a fairly pedestrian thing, just spending time on the phones, working with people to keep them together. But that's what a lot of resources and effort is put into.
Thanks, Jay. That's brilliant. So with that, we'll close our session. I want to thank everyone. But again, I think the message of building partnerships, the inclusivity, funding it seriously, even though it's so hard to make the case of funding direct services versus this, but I think hopefully today we've begun to make that case, allowing context to determine tactics and strategies, and being open to what emerges, and never, never underestimate the power of women's anger and women's issues to really drive this agenda forward, which we've seen from this. So thanks, everyone. This was really great. Thank you so much.